probably in. All right, so why don't we begin? And I'll start with welcoming everyone to this panel. All right. Katie, can you follow up with Regan? He just
yep, I just sent him a note. I did.
Okay, so we're waiting for one more participant of the panelists, but we will begin. Again, good afternoon. Welcome everyone. This is the NITRD panel on CMMC, Raising the Bar on Cybersecurity Maturity. I'm Thomas Wagon, Technical Coordinator for Cybersecurity Research at the Networking and IT R&D National Coordination Office. And I'll explain all of that. And with us, we have a very good and strong panel that's going to discuss with you and give us an insight on what is CMMC, why do we need to worry about it, what is the research role in all of that, and what is the kind of impact that we hope to achieve. So let me introduce our panelists first. I'll start with kind of at the top of the list that I have it, with Miss Stacy Bostjanick. She's the Director of Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC policy, at the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment in the Department of Defense. And in this role, she's responsible for managing the initiation of the CMMC program. She's responsible for establishing all of the policy and procedures with regards to the CMMC. Next, we have Katie Stewart. She is a senior member of the technical staff at the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. She's one of the architects of the CMMC model and is part of the team at SCI that developed CMMC together with colleagues at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, or APL, which is also a university affiliated research center, just like SCI. So she has very intimate knowledge of what CMMC is and how it was developed. In a minute or so, we will also be joining by Regan Edens. He is a member of the board of directors of the CMMC accreditation body and is the chair of the Committee on Standards within the CMMC accreditation body. He's also the Chief Transformation Officer of DTC Global, and the role of assessors or accreditation of assessors who then in turn will assess companies and their maturity levels is clearly a major piece of putting CMMC into action, and we'll hear more about that. On the agenda, we also had another gentleman, Terry Aber, listed. He will not be able to join us today. So with that introduction, let me say a few words about kind of putting all of this in context. Why are we here and why does this matter? First of all, a little bit about the panel itself. So NITRD is the federal government's networking and IT R&D coordination forum for coordinating research in networking and IT. Every year, the federal government spends invests about $4.5 billion in basic research in various IT domains, cybersecurity being one of them. And it's invested and the programs are run by the various agencies such as NSF, for the academic-based research, but it spans the spectrum of research agencies, projects, with hundreds of people involved and thousands of activities and projects. So all of that is coordinated. That's the role of the NITRD program and the role of the National Coordination Office, where I am. And so we help federal agencies and people behind these programs basically get smart about who's doing what and why, and help coordinate ideas that lead to strategic plans and kind of a vision for future research. So in that role, this panel is, one of its purposes is to highlight a role of federal government in cybersecurity research and bring together and help you see what the priorities, what the issues are from the federal government's perspective, because the federal government is one of the major, if not the key, basic research funder for cybersecurity research in this country. So we chose this topic to discuss an aspect of security or cybersecurity that needs to be in front of us, but probably is not as much, which is, if you step back and think about security, right, it's part technology, it's part the matters of economics, markets, incentive, disincentives, liabilities, and so on. And it's part social behavior, right? It's part people, their decisions, people as the users, defenders, attackers, and the organizations. And so we cannot forget that in order to improve security, we cannot just deal with technology, right? We have to deal with these other areas as well. And there's a role for research, and there's a role to do things that then collectively can help improve security outcomes. We know a lot about how to secure technologies, but if it's not used, then it doesn't quite matter, right? So with this panel, we're going to look at an area of not just the technology, but how do the processes, how do the, in this case, sort of cybersecurity maturity levels and practices relate to better cybersecurity? What is the specific role of CMMC in doing that? And we hope to discuss also for this audience, what sort of research is needed? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the gaps in this area and this process where help is needed? So sort of with that introduction, just to remind you, the chat window is open, so feel free to jump in and post questions if you have any, and we'll be monitoring that as well. All right, so what we'll do now is we'll begin with Stacy and let her start the whole panel by asking, what is CMMC, right? Why is the Department of Defense doing it? And what does DoD hope to achieve with this? Stacy?
Thank you. So back in 2013, the department started work with the NIST 853 and the idea of applying those standards to the DIB partners. Through the culmination of comments and perspectives, they came to the NIST 800-171. And in 2017, the 252-204-7012 clause was introduced in the DFARS that said that companies had to look at their networks, and if they handled controlled unclassified information, they had a requirement to meet the standards as laid out in NIST 800-171. So that went into place. What it said was you went through, you had to have a system security plan, and if you didn't meet all of the standards in the NIST 800-171, you had to have a plan of action and milestones to close those gaps as time went by to make sure that you were compliant with that standard. As we started to look, and the GAO did, or the GAO and the IG, I think the IG was the DoD IG audit was the first one that came out, where they went to a sampling of companies to see how they were progressing with that compliance, and they basically found out they weren't. The Navy Cyber Readiness Review also corroborated that finding and found that most companies were just saying that they were meeting the compliance, but they actually, most of them didn't even understand what some of the requirements were. So from that, the DoD had a strong desire to ensure that companies that were handling that information had a validation that they were indeed meeting the compliance. That's how CMMC was born. Now, with CMMC, we recognize that we don't want cybersecurity. You know, at one point they were talking about making it the fourth pillar of acquisition. And what we recognize is you don't want it to be a pillar, you want it to be a foundational effort. And that's what we're striving to achieve with CMMC. That security becomes a foundational issue. The companies start thinking ahead of the attacks and the threats that are out there and become witting of what type of things are being attacked with and make positive moves to protect themselves before they ever get hacked, as opposed to waiting for the time. As we've gone through this, you know, it's been interesting because we've had a bunch of the different associations that have done surveys. And at one point, like 70% of companies had the impression that they had never been hacked and that they had never suffered any loss. And of course, the sad part about that is, no, they just didn't realize that they had been hacked. So as we see with the loss of data from the federal government and how we've tracked it, it's through sloppy cybersecurity. It's through people not taking the ownership to put some of these basic things in place to protect their systems. And, you know, when we started putting this together, and I'm going to let Ms. Stewart talk more about the different practices that we went through because she was the architect and understands a lot, you know, more in depth of the rationale behind some of these things. But the level 1 for CMMC, it's equivalent to the 52204-21 that companies were supposed to be meeting in the FAR all along anyway. And so I have to say, I'm not a technical person. So when my guys explained it to me, they're like, Stacy, this is what you need to do to make sure your neighbor can't watch your Netflix, right? This is stuff that you should be doing in your own home to protect your own identity. And companies are experiencing identity theft of their cage codes. You know, we have companies that have lost payments because somebody's been able to hack into their system, change the routing of that cage code to their bank account. I met a guy down in South Carolina. He lost $40,000. And when he went back to the government and said, hey, where's my money? They're like, we paid you. He's like, well, I didn't get it. And when they looked, somebody had stolen his identity and rerouted his payment. And unfortunately, there's nobody there to help him. The federal government didn't have another $40,000 to just go, oh, that's okay. We'll give you another 40K. Sorry about that, right? No, he was out his money. And so these kinds of things are as much a protection for yourself as they are for protecting the data and our national security, because we are losing information and we are losing our military edge and our superiority in the world based on the fact that we're losing this data at such rapid rates. That's exactly why there's another airplane that looks just like the JSF flying around in China. And the scary part about it is it still has the exact same flaws that the US-based one did. So they didn't even take the data and do any analysis on it. They just took everything we did and put it into play. And quite frankly, I used to work at NavAir where they developed that. I saw those guys spending millions of hours trying to figure out why they were having some of the problems they did. The blood, sweat, and tears on the back of the US researchers and engineers to put that program together for it to get stolen like that. And all their hard work was just cheated, right? They cheated and stole our design, and now they are equivalent to us because they have the exact same aircraft. So the intent of CMMC is to bring that to the forefront for people to acknowledge it and understand it, to get out ahead of it, and make it one of the foundational things that we think about in our programs. And Ms. Stewart can tell you all the different maturity issues that we put in place, because it's not just cybersecurity, it's personnel, it's facility. I mean, it's a holistic look, and that's what we tried to achieve with the CMMC model. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Great introduction. So yes, why don't we jump into some of the sort of decisions under the hood. In a sense, you know, Katie was and is part of the team that has developed CMMC. And so, you know, we can start maybe probing that question with looking at, you know, kind of what is cybersecurity maturity, right? What I struggle a bit with is, you know, cybersecurity is contextual, right? It relates to risk, you know, threats, the vulnerabilities, the consequences, and there's a lot of sort of, you know, art to apply to analyzing it, not so much, you know, science, right? But, you know, as the architect of the CMMC model and maturity idea, Katie, what went into the development of CMMC, right? What were the key elements? Can you talk about?
Yeah, yeah, at a high level,
SCI?
Yeah, so the Software Engineering Institute, you know, many people are familiar with CMMI, which was our, you know, beginning work around maturity models developed back in the 1980s. It was specifically designed to measure the performance of software contractors for the DoD, right? That's how it started. It's since evolved across, you know, multiple sectors. It's now managed out of ACSAC by the CMMI Institute. But that really set kind of the groundwork in our research and work in maturity models. Those of you that are familiar with CMMI, you know, there's a lot in it, right? It's looking at very specific aspects of process maturity, or, you know, the institutionalization of process. CMMC is not, you know, CMMI for cybersecurity. That's not what we've done here. You know, CMMC really was designed to be, you know, used by small business as well as large business in a way that is the most effective for process maturity. And so if you look at the model, there's two sides, right? There's the technical practices side. And once you get up to level 3, there's 130 practices that are required to be implemented to gain access to CUI or controlled unclassified information. On the process side, on the process maturity side, we really identified 5 activities, if you will, that we saw the biggest bang for our buck. So in our research at the SCI, we've looked at 600 to 700 critical infrastructure organizations and done cyber assessments. And what we found is if these organizations meet these 5 you know, process maturity activities, we actually see that they outperform technically as well on the technical practice side. So if you're familiar with CMMC, you'll see that, you know, we're looking at things like the development of policy, which basically establishes, you know, senior level sponsorship of and shows the importance of CMMC. We're looking at the documentation of practices, right? Being able to write down what you do and then do what you write down. We're looking at the management of CMMC activities. So, you know, is somebody behind the wheel? Are you funding this well? Are you training your people? Do you have the right people? And then as you get up to the higher levels within CMMC, we're looking at, you know, doing measurement and analysis and the performance of these activities and making improvements. And then at the highest level, level 5, we're really looking at, are these organizations optimizing their activities? So fundamentally, this idea of, you know, moving from what Ms. Bostjanick talked about, you know, this self-attestation, I'm doing what I should be doing, when in fact we know that that's not actually happening, to this maturity model approach, right? We're really looking at creating a fundamental cultural shift across the DIB, right? This is not just a snapshot in time. I sign up, I make my assessment, I get my certification, and I forget it, right? These processes, these 5 processes that are in the model, they are there to make sure that these capabilities continue to endure and improve, you know, once the CMMC certification has been complete. So that's kind of just an overview of kind of the process side of CMMC.
Great, thank you, Katie. I'm going to direct next questions to Regan. He's with us now. As I mentioned, he is on the board of directors of the CMMC accreditation body and chairs the committee on standards. And so I'm going to pose a tough question, I think.
Sure.
In my head, it's a tough question.
Far away, Thomas.
So with CMMC, right, in kind of my mind, we're squarely in the subject of measuring, assessing cybersecurity, right? We're saying if you do this, your security outcomes will be better. And so the next question is, well, how much better? And as we know, you know, assessing or measuring cybersecurity is very difficult, right? We haven't been really able to do that, you know, well in, you know, last 50 years. But if we were able to do that better, right, it would certainly help CMMC with its rollout, you know, because then you can see the value better, right? It would help with improving CMMC because we can then look at places that we can optimize. We can look at, you know, if you do this, your cybersecurity, whatever that means, will be better, right? And if we can measure them, then we can see the impact, we can see the kind of return on the effort and investments. So in the context of cybersecurity maturity, and since you know, you deal with the standards and the standardization of these issues, is this something we can, you know, measure better? Is this something, or how can we assess the improvements brought about by different levels of CMMC, right? What are the challenges here? How do you see this?
Well, let's see. It's a really tough question. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, as you point out, the standard challenge for all CIOs and CISOs out there, and IT leads and cybersecurity professionals is how do I add value to the business workflow and demonstrate the fact that we've done our job. So it's very difficult in terms of sort of like the intelligence community challenge that we struggle with as well, which is how do you demonstrate the fact that you've defended the network and safeguarded the network and the data in sort of in the absence of evidence, or in the absence of obvious evidence for those that sit outside of that arena. But I think that if we sort of pivot the discussion and we talk about in terms of looking at it from an ecosystem model. So when we look at the national security interest and we look at the disparity of security across the entire defense industrial base, from the prime contractors all the way down to, you know, the lowest tier subs that receive this data. I think when we look in terms of managing a baseline of that risk with by standardizing the implementation of a baseline of practices, what we do is we raise the tide so that at least all of the boats have a standard baseline for which to judge what success is, and how effective are these controls when we're looking at, you know, and the implementation of cyber hygiene, the implementation of security and data management, the implementation of physical security requirements, in a scope and a spectrum that really hasn't yet been done. Katie's highlight of the fact that this is literally a cultural shift across the entire defense industrial base really recognizes the fact that at the prime contractor level, it's not much of a shift. We manage data, we have classified data, we have other types of data, we have security protocols and security requirements that we implement every day. But when we expand away from the prime contractors, the large prime contractors, into the lowest tier subs, that's not a practice that's routine or uniform across this ecosystem that we call the defense industrial base. So I think that the important piece here is to be able to establish this baseline, and then establish what right looks like in uniformity across of all of the actors within this ecosystem, and then really then take a hard look at how do we measure success. Do we measure success through, many folks have talked about sort of a uniform monitoring when we discuss dashboarding of security metrics in a uniform way. These are all future potentialities, but at the end of the day, it is a radical, not radical, because it's necessary, needed, and has been for a long time, but it's an important implementation of these standardized practices that really is a transformative for most of the defense industrial base when we look beyond tier 1 and down to the lowest tier subs. So I haven't really, it's a challenge. The metrics are a challenge, but I think what we say to begin to the process of understanding what is the value add, we know from a best practices perspective, when we have these practices implemented, we have a baseline security that is meaningful and is measurable at some point in the future. So when we look at recommendations for studies in the future, might be what are the number of reportable events? What are the number of overall security incidents that a contractor manages and deals with? Looking at from the prime contractors all the way down to the lowest tier subs. How do we capture that data is going to be a challenge, and I think that there is an opportunity for visibility across the ecosystem in standardizing both practices but applications and those metrics in reviewing and understanding what does it mean to be secure? What does it mean to manage the balance between security and compliance when we talk about the CMMC ecosystem? So it's a complex problem. It is a future solution for sure, but we began with baby steps, as I like to say, baby steps up the mountain, and those baby steps is standardizing those best practices, fundamental basic requirements of security across an enormous ecosystem, both obviously domestically and inside across globally within the U.S. defense supply chain, immediate and then of course extended in our global partners and allies.
Okay, thank you, Regan. Just to complete kind of the big picture and context here. So, as we're hearing, right, there are a number of practices, number of security controls that have been defined, and CMMC creates levels of groups of controls and practices that as you do more of them and you do them and they get more advanced, then your cybersecurity maturity increases and your outcomes should increase or be better as well for security. And then as we heard, this is the first time that it's being mandated across a large ecosystem. In this case, starting with the defense industrial base for DoD. Now, just to complete the context here, so CMMC focuses on, right, implementing set of practices and controls, right? So it basically addresses the question of, you need to do the right things.
Right.
There's also the question of you need to do those things right. So, and that's kind of the other half. And so it's one thing to say, do you have these sorts of controls implemented that deal with, let's say, authentication or management of different parts of the enterprise and the IT systems. But then the question is, well, how well do you do them?
Right.
Because I can say, well, I have good, I have access control and authentication measures, but they're broken, right?
Right.
And so my point is, what about the other half, which is, are we doing the proper things? Are we doing them right? Is there a role for CMMC to help with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that one of the things that Stacy and Katie and all of those that are involved in the working groups can testify to is that consistency and uniformity of application begins with clarity. And it is a struggle to bring about the right wording and the right level of detail that supports a uniform implementation of all these requirements among an enormous disparity of knowledge, skills, and abilities out across the defense industrial base. And we have literally spent, I mean, Stacy and Katie can attest to this, thousands of hours working through refinements and wording in the ability to bring clarity and consistency to these standards. Because it's that in itself is an art for sure. I think that the challenge is once you we raise I think we have the high bar set for our own personal standards to get this as right as possible, but it's not going to be right, and there's going to be ambiguity and uncertainty and miswording and missteps, because we're sort of bridging the gap between compliance, which is very detail oriented and definition and phrase driven by precedent, legal precedent, and regulatory compliance, and cybersecurity, which is yes, the wording needs to be correct, but can people understand it to implement the wording? And so there's this careful balance that we consistently stumble back and forth across in order to bring uniformity and consistency during the implementation. I think that when you look at the uniformity and implementation, that's when you begin to understand how effective are your controls, how well that they have been implemented, how well can you measure the effectiveness of the implementation. Because without uniformity implementation, we really look from OSC, that's organization seeking certification, from OSC to OSC. But when we evaluate that, we also struggle with the consistency between certified assessor and certified assessor. And because culturally, we're trying to build uniformity across the entire Cmmc ecosystem. We also look at the disparity between the cultures from C3PO to C3PAO. So each C3PO is sort of going to have likely to have its own specialty. It's likely to have its own unique sort of culture and attitude and approach to the assessors, and the assessors, of course, their individual sort of likenesses and biases and emphasis. So I think that the challenge for us together is to look at this from a comprehensive perspective, which is it's all about the people. It's always about the people. Cybersecurity always starts with people first, and really the technology second. So when we look at that, we have to really look at how are the people going to do this? How are they going to have clarity and certainty so that they have a clear understanding for implementation, and how well is that implementation going to be consistent? And then again, how consistent are we going to be in evaluating practice by practice? And then of course, assessment objective by assessment objective. So there's an enormous amount of, layers to the cake here, or in interpretation that can be challenging.
Okay, thank you. Let's jump into a couple questions that have been posed on the chat. One is, and let's start with you, Stacy. Can you discuss the timeline for implementation of this, as well as what sort of percentage of the industrial base, either the US or defense industrial base, will be capable of complying with CMMC?
Well, so the timeline is right now, we started with a proposed rule that got converted to an interim rule based on the recognition of the national security threat. So as of November 30th, we closed the public comment period and our rule became effective. Now it is possible for the DoD to have CMMC as part of a new acquisition and a requirement of award. Moving forward, going to adjudicate all of the comments that we received from the Federal Register. And so therefore, going into the final rule, it is possible that the model could change. Our implementation processes could change from where we are now based on the comments. We have to adjudicate those comments and then go back through coordination with OMB for our rule to become final. We anticipate that happening in the spring. We just completed negotiations and signed our no-cost contract with the AB right before Thanksgiving. So we can, because we were all ready to go get turkey. So we made sure we got it done. And so now they are working rapidly to bring on staff and start getting ready to have the assessors, because each assessor, if you're going to be an assessor of CMMC level 1, you have to have a tier 1 suitability background determination. And anything higher than tier 1, you have to have a tier 3 suitability background determination. So each assessor will have a background determination done before they will be allowed to go out and perform assessments. The C3 PAOs, because of the data that they're going to be encountering and working with in the assessments, is deemed to be CUI, will all themselves have to go through a CMMC assessment and have to be CMMC level 3 certified to be able to perform the assessment. Right. So we're rapidly working to get all of those pieces of the puzzle in place so that we hope to have assessors ready to roll around March is what I'm thinking, and you know, hopefully earlier, but trying, you know, in this year of COVID and, you know, the whole transition and everything else, I'm going to be a little bit conservative, and I'm going to say we'll probably have people ready about March to start doing assessments. We're also in the process of identifying the 10 to 15 pilot programs that we intend to implement in FY21. The perspective is that would be no more than 1,500 companies that would be impacted. Now, you know, one of the things that we have to look at, and one of the challenges that we're working on right now, is that all depends on what CUI a contractor has, right? And so I'm sure people are getting tired of hearing the story, but Ms. Arrington went out to Transcom, and there was a welder out there, and he asked her to come out to his spaces because he was like, I'm a welder. What do I need with cybersecurity, right? And so she said it was funny because they made sure she had her closed-toed shoes and her protective glasses, and she didn't wear any nylon. She only had on cotton, and they were very over the top about all the safety standards she had to meet. So she got out there, and she said, well, how do you know what to weld? He says, oh, they send it to me. She said, well, where? And so she showed him her laptop, his laptop on top of the counter. And she said you could see his Facebook instant messenger blinking, and, you know, his Amazon delivery was on there, and it was all on the same laptop. And she said she recognized the program he had up was an AutoCAD program, and it was zoomed in on one particular area. And she said, can you zoom that out so I can see what it was? He had the structural design of one of our tactical aircraft. And she said, don't you think our adversaries might want to get a hold of that? And he was like, I guess maybe, right? And then she said, okay, well, how about this? Do you think maybe they'd want to hack in and change the tolerances on your weld? So then you lose your quality. And so therefore you stop getting business. And so our industrial base erodes, and we have to go to some of our adversaries to get this work done. Or how about even they get in, they steal your cage code, and they steal the payments, like I discussed earlier, where people are losing their DOD identities. It's identity theft of companies. And he's kind of like, yeah, I guess so, right? So from that perspective, we have a couple of big rocks we have to work through. It doesn't make good business sense for us to say, okay, a program has to be CMMC level 3, and that would flow down to each and every subcontractor. At some point, you're going to have a sub that's not going to be doing work that has to have that critical data that would be CUI, right? What we find, as in the case of the welder, is the prime was lazy, right? It was easier to just copy and paste and click that structural design into an email, shoot it off to him, and let him figure out where the welds are and do it, as opposed to them going into that AutoCAD program, cutting out those welds and sending just the welds to him. Now, I don't know for sure, because I'm not a structural engineer, to say whether you would have to characterize those particular welds as CUI, but one would think that if you disaggregated it from the whole, then it would lose its trappings of the level 3 CUI and could be considered CMMC level 1. So I think there's a lot of consternation out in industry about, oh my God, we've all got to be CMMC level 3. We only anticipate about 20% of companies needing to be CMMC level 3 or higher. The rest would only ever have to be level 1 or 2 if you so chose. And 2, we put in place as kind of a waypoint, because we recognize that trying to jump from 1 to 3 with all the different controls, going from 17 controls to 130, was a bit of a gap. So we made sure we had a CMMC level 2 as a waypoint for people to be able to grow and work to get there. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think that provides a lot of good details, and it relates, Stacy, since we have you, to another question about smaller, research organizations, university-based research organizations or teams, research that needs to bring together members from multiple organizations into, DoD sponsored or funded research. What is the situation with the ability to conduct research for DoD with CMMC and CUI being or not being applied to such teams?
So when we start looking at applied research and we start talking about how that data gets applied, and if it's applied in a critical DoD program, it would be considered CUI, and there would be a need for CMMC level 3. One of the difficulties that we're finding is a lot of our data loss is coming from these applied research areas and the smaller companies that don't have their cyber hygiene dialed in. And so that causes a lot of problems, right? I mean, then we get back to the fact that we've put how many billions of dollars and millions of hours, or maybe even billions of hours in developing aircraft, right? And now our adversary has one just like it. So we've got to protect ourselves. It really becomes a point of national security. And it also becomes an individual for those research firms as well. I would think that you would want to protect the information, your research, and the things that you develop, because that's your intellectual property. And not protecting it, you're giving your adversary all your hard-earned work. Your brain power that you used to come up with that is now stolen. Somebody cheated. It's like having the kid next to you that got an A+ on the test because they cheated off of you, right? I'm sorry, but that just irritates me. I don't want somebody to be able to get away with my work, right? So I think we definitely need to take that on. Now, CMMC is not the end-all be-all, right? It's helping us buy down the risk. We've got farther to go on this path to be totally locked down, but that's why we want to, we're praying that our partners in industry embrace this and recognize the threat to our livelihoods and our lifestyle. And until we get serious about it, I don't know about you guys, but have you seen the China 2025 cartoon where they're saying they want to overtake us economically by 2025 and militarily by 2030? I mean, they're pretty out there. They're pretty open and honest, like, we're coming for you. And they're there. They're after us, right? Every time you turn around, they're trying to inhibit our ability to come up with a vaccine, right? They're attacking us from every angle. We need to protect ourselves. This is something we've got to do. Now I can get off my soapbox. Sorry.
No, I mean, if I can elaborate on what Stacy just said, I often say that, this to every audience that I can. This is the first time that we're doing compliance, not for the sake of compliance. I can tell you, having spent time in this space intimately since 2005, this is the gravest national security threat in the history of the United States of America. That is not hyperbole. It is not exaggeration. That is a cold reality that everything that we faced in our personal lives with passwords being, compromised, and our credit cards being stolen from us, and the houses, mortgage fraud, and all of these things which interrelate with cybersecurity and technology and identity theft and password theft. This has been happening to us ubiquitously across the entire defense industrial base for a decade. And it is, I am so grateful to Katie and to the PMO team and Stacy for leading the way to getting this done, because it's absolutely a necessity. So I try to ease the angst with many business owners to just remind them that, this is not the government just telling you can't cut your mattress tags off your mattress, right? This is real. And it's important, and it really truly is safeguarding not only our business interests now, but the legacy of our children and our grandchildren. And I wish that were hyperbole, but it is not. Every single minute of this webcast information and data will be stolen from us and by our adversaries and repurposed to eventually take us out, to eventually remove us as the beacon of freedom in the world. And I don't want that to happen. I've spent my entire adult life defending our national security interests, and that's why really why all of us are here today.
Excellent points. Let's be more a little bit maybe specific in terms of collaboration. We have a question from Laura. So can you provide some suggestions or framework or vision into how do people now collaborate or should collaborate in research environment when they are dealing with the CUI, the controlled unclassified information? What are your suggestions?
If I may, one of the things that I often, because remember I'm in this space, right? So we've been in the space in the trenches as a subject matter expert for the past 4 or 5 years now, and in the client space, in the recommendations that I generally provide is that treating your individual researchers as 1099s and both direct employees to universities and to laboratories is critical in safeguarding them and providing an atmosphere which they can exchange information ideas in a compliant manner. Because in emulating very similarly what has been done for ITAR for many years now, of course there are additional requirements and there are different requirements that are unique to ITAR that are different from CMMC. But as a baseline standard, of course, we can look at them uniformly that we would protect both types of CUI, potentially CUI, the same. So what I recommend is that a university research organization or a laboratory organization that employs an enormous variety of persons, both direct employees and students and 1099 researchers, is to create an environment that's scalable. So you take that environment and then you obviously meet the requirements of your main system and enterprise, and then you tailor the unique applications to the researchers' unique needs, so that your individual researchers are not carrying that burden, but they have the tools at hand, and those tools for management and uniformity. The third process requirement for CMC level 3, managing those responsibilities is feasible and sustainable across for example, a CMM research ecosystem, if the applications and the technologies used by all of the participants are uniform. So that standardizes your cost, it standardizes your implementation, it standardizes your support, it standardizes your training, so that as you onboard and offboard individual researchers, you have a uniform training that they go through. And again, it provides a uniform tool set that would be familiar to all of the participants within your different research programs and projects.
Stacy, do you want to add to it anything specific about, and I know it's an evolving policy question, university-based research, right? That's sponsored by DoD. What sort of changes should they anticipate or requirements in those environments?
Well, so CMMC will apply to government contracts with universities that handle CUI, and they will actually even apply to those that don't, because they'll require the CMMC level 1, which is basic research. When you get into the international partners area, I'm not in a good position to talk about that. I know that the department has crafted some policies and some directives that you can go out and probably look on the web to get the specifics of, but there are some areas that are of concern, like the 1,000 Talents program, those types of things, right?
Yes, thank you. Let's switch a little bit. I want to make sure we have time for discussion around this to kind of the research side, the research element, because this is the research audience and forum. Can you talk more about what sort of challenges do you see with CMMC in terms of either the foundations, the theory, the deployment, how do we scale these processes and the impact. So what sort of challenges do you see, and where do you think research might be helpful?
So I can start with that. So I know, you know, with the model, the way it is today is likely not what it's going to look like a few years from now, right? We cannot be satisfied, you know, thinking that this is going to be our solution as our, you know, enemies take on different attack vectors, right? So if you're familiar with Cmmc at level 3, there are 20 additional practices that do not align with NIST 800-171. And these were very deliberate, right? There were 3 separate buckets that we kind of came up with to develop these technical additions to the model. And you know, I see that over time evolving, right? One of the set of practices that was added to the model was to specifically go against the known most common threats to the DIB, the phishing, the malware, and you know, things like that. So we specifically added threats or added practices to mitigate those threats. And I think we're going to look to the research community to help us be forward-looking as we update the model. Probably even more so as levels 4 and 5, you know, take their shape and get rolled out as we move forward, because that's where we're going to be protecting our most critical data. So I think there's that kind of on the technical side in terms of updates to the model. And then the same applies for the process side, right? We have tons of data from CMMI that looks at, you know, gains and efficiencies. You know, people are really pushing back about, you know, the cost of CMMC, but when you start to document your practices and manage your budgets and do your measurement programs, you're going to gain efficiencies. These initial costs up front for implementing the CMMC practices, you're going to see a return on investment in doing that, not only for the protection of your information, but in the efficiency gained in the way, you know, your business operations occur. So I have a particular interest in, you know, that type of research to really look at, you know, how are we improving, you know, business in the DIB? You know, we're becoming more secure, but at the same time, we're enacting, you know, good business practices, at least on our IT security side. And we should see gains from that as well. So from a model development standpoint, you know, we are absolutely looking for, you know, the research community to help inform us as we evolve the model, you know, moving forward.
Thank you. Regan, do you have thoughts on this?
You're muted.
Thanks, Stacy, as always. So I do have some thoughts on this. I think that there are 2 important aspects to the future. The future in research really is functioning on the ability to maintain confidentiality of the data, both from the national security interest, but also the proprietary interest of the individual company, and the proprietary interest of the individual company to have certain information available and being share that information, security metrics and dashboarding information for compliance across the ecosystem, because the future is automated, but also protecting their internal activities and sort of that fine line between what do we report as a participant in the ecosystem to our prime contractors or to our higher tier subcontractors, and then how does that information get captured and then visualized and made useful to sort of think of it as a meta metrics reporting system for all DoD. Imagine for a moment what life would be like if the DoD, from a safeguarding and cybersecurity interest, could see the aggregate reporting of every single DIB participant for their security metrics and be able to analyze that for adversarial threat behavior, activity, targeting, all of the sorts of things for to understand what the adversaries are pursuing, what types of information, what types of activities, and different types of techniques that they're using to penetrate the defense industrial base. That knowledge would be unprecedented, number one, and number two is it would provide an insight in sort of the metametrics analysis that would be truly superb, in sort of understanding our adversaries' tactics, and both not just adversaries but also organized crime and malicious actors in general. I think that would be so managing the proprietary interests of the organization and maintaining the internal internal network activities, and safeguarding that data, providing a universal set of metrics for transparency and that dashboarding and reporting. The other avenue that I think is absolutely critical, that really the cybersecurity industry in general has uniquely failed at, and that is the human. So human beings are the ultimate weak, both strength and weakness of every single organization. And as much as we try to automate and bring technology to bear to compensate for human behavior, there is no compensation ultimately for human behavior. You know, if you look at if you compound all of the malicious exploits and activities, about 90% of them are all centered around human beings. And so, and rather than working against this and sort of always promising that the next generation firewall will make a difference, what we should really take a very hard look at is the human behavior interface between training, knowledge, and expertise, and technology, and bringing that down to the individual user level. Because one of the challenges that organizations will face is institutionalization. It's bringing the practices appropriately down to the individual user. And so, and that's the key really to all of this, the key to everything: how I handle the data, how I meet and sustain my access control policy, or my remote access control policy as an individual user, as an individual employee, is based on my knowledge, is based on culture, is based on my own individual expertise, my attitudes, how well have I been trained, how well am I knowledgeable in the anchor points that are relevant to me actually doing what I'm supposed to do. So I think that this human behavior interaction between security, technology, and culture is absolutely critical to having a much better understanding of how more effective can we be in taking technology and bringing it to bear inside of the average corporate environment.
Thank you. I'm going to rephrase a question that was posted, but it relates to the future of CMMC. So CMMC mainly deals with better handling of controlled unclassified information, CUI, within the defense industrial base. And so it's heavy on confidentiality objectives, right? But security is wider than that, and it also deals with availability, safety, and other aspects, right? And CMMC, is a framework, so you can bring in different controls and different processes and different tools into it, right? It's meant to be that way. We heard from Katie that CMMC needs to evolve to account for future threats and controls. Yeah. But do you see CMMC needing to encompass in greater weight and focus other things than being sort of heavy on confidentiality right now, and also look into the other aspects of security?
So it is envisioned that CMMC will move into other areas. I think, the next phase, we're looking at OT systems, manufacturing floor type things, and equipment. I'm not quite so sure that when we get outside of those kinds of things, if it would be CMMC that would be, CMMC is the first brick, right? We're starting to build the foundation, and then we will move from there. And as it becomes, technology gets to the point where we can use it to do other things and monitor other things and things of that nature, then certainly we will move as technology progresses into different areas of security. You know, we work very closely with our intelligence friends. We work very closely with, you know, all the members in the department to make sure that we're securing our entire supply chain, right? So it is part of a bigger plan, I guess is the best way to answer that.
You know, just to elaborate on something that Stacy said, so because it's so important. When she gave her example about the welder using Katie's story, I cannot tell you how critical it is and how subtle it would be if you change the tolerances on a weld on one particular portion of an aircraft that you know would create a fatal failure, not at the 100th hour, but at the 1000th hour, right, of flight time. And so having the integrity, identifying methods of building in integrity into our documentation and making sure that blueprint or that engineering drawing that was received by the welder was in fact the right and hadn't been altered in any way, right? So hashing and other types of mechanisms that you can do to preserve the integrity of our documentation, because you could literally spend. Imagine the Osprey program. If you guys remember, you know, the Ospreys would fall out of the sky and no one really understood why, right? And that's close to heart because of my time in the Special Operations program. And so you have an aircraft. It should work, but for some reason there's some mechanical or structural failure, and the aircraft literally falls out of the sky. And no one could. It took quite a bit of time for them to work out the details and identify the problems. But engineering those fatal flaws by our adversaries, you must certainly that they have put enormous amounts of thought and time and probably energy into maniacally thinking about those opportunities to do that. So I think that, as Stacy pointed out, as we move into the future of maintaining the integrity of the documentation that we do share, and that we need to share in order to execute these challenges, as we monitor and as we do the important things and add on the additional attributes of them to the model and to the implementation, I think that those mechanisms in terms of research, those mechanisms that will allow the average environment to be able to maintain integrity of their documentation, and be able to in very quick order know whether a document has been potentially flawed or manipulated, is absolutely critical to the future of again supplying or securing our supply chain.
So I'll ask another question in terms of the future of CMMC. So at the higher levels of controls or higher levels of risk and the appropriate handling of it, do you see there's a need for not just identifying, these are the controls, these are the practices, these are the things you should be doing, but also verifying in some ways that they are being done the right way, that they are being actually done properly? In other words, do you think there's going to be a need to add validation and then standardize that within CMMC in terms of, for example, an organization will need to be certified that they have the maturity, that they have the controls, and they are implementing them at the proper level, but also, for example, be certified that through some sort of standardized penetration testing or some other validation operationally steps to also be certified that indeed, not that they have the controls and they thought about it, but that they are actually implemented properly and that those controls actually do what is intended to happen with those kinds of outcomes. Anyone?
Yeah, so that's a slippery slope, right? Penetration testing from the government side on a government contractor. So, it would all have to be on a voluntary basis at this point in time. Now, having said that, sure, it would be a wonderful thing if our DIB partners would embrace that and agree to that type of validation. Right? But the best right now is that the CMMC assessors will have the ability to go at least see and view what the companies are doing to be able to provide a validation from that point in time. You know, I guess the way the US's laws and freedoms are set up is, you know, we can't just start penetration testing on companies without their approval and agreement and knowledge. You know, that would be a little big brother-ish and probably not well received. So, but, you know, we do have capabilities where we can test what we put in the model, own labs to do modeling and simulation of penetration testing to test out our theories, right? And Katie, you're going to have to help me here because, you know, I'm not as simple as you are, but, you know, we do kind of test these things out. We didn't just like slap it together and stick it out there. We've done some background investigation to be able to validate the standards that we chose to put in the model. But most certainly, if a company was interested in participating in doing stuff like that, I'm sure the government would embrace it and work with them and appreciate their willingness to you know, secure our country.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that the higher levels of the model, we did run through the NSA DOD-CAR threat modeling tool to ensure, you know, that you know, we're doing a good job. But I think, you know, Regan can speak to, you know, what an assessor will do on site. But to Stacy's point, absolutely, right? The higher levels of the model have practices in there that look at, you know, are you red teaming your capabilities? Are you being proactive? You know, I'll let Regan speak to how that's, you know, going to be assessed. But those types of activities are certainly at the higher levels within the model because that's where our more critical data is, you know, going to be stored and housed.
Yeah, the thing that I would add is that the model is built on a very robust platform, which is, you know, NIST 800-171 alpha. So when you look at it in terms of the assessment methodology, which the model team did a fantastic job in incorporating and applying and amplifying some additional data with in terms of examine, what do you examine, who do you talk to when you interview, and what do you test, right? So these three methodologies allow an assessor to be able to evaluate whether or not, using 2 out of the 3, evaluate whether or not an organization has met those requirements. There is a challenge though. And the challenge is that an organization is very complex. You have 130 practices and time matters because time is indexed really to cost, right? And labor. So the balance is to be able to do this effectively and to do this in a way that really meets the explicit and implicit expectation of the DoD, which is they expect that after the assessment has been certified, that the organization properly safeguards both FCI and CUI. And so it has met those requirements and has met them to the satisfaction of the knowledge, skills, and experience of the assessor to judge whether or not that they have met practices and are conforming. So I think that there is a future where we can automate some of these testing functions, most certainly. The baby steps, of course, is as Stacy mentioned, is to put a person on the ground, walking through the environment and engaging those defense industrial base and in sort of walking up this steep mountain together, but doing so very quickly and with purpose, of course. But so we first start out with the human aspect, and very quickly I think we're going to see opportunities to automate, and then with automation builds efficiency. But remember, at the end of the day, it's the humans. So humans are very, very important. We wouldn't want a tool that just used AI and that just did an evaluation of of an organization through some automated process, because you miss the human aspect of that culture, of the knowledge, skills, and abilities of the individual employees and the persons that are responsible for each of the practices. So there is going to, automation is in the near-term future for sure, in evaluating these practices, but certainly, most certainly, the humans make up that vital difference, because it's the humans that really matter most to cybersecurity.
Yes, excellent. And we have about 4 minutes, so I want to make sure we have a chance to kind of provide succinct summary. So let me start with a few words. So as you have seen, right, we have painted this picture where we already have lots of good security controls defined, a lot of good thoughts that went into how to secure systems, and that's represented and described in the various, for example, NIST publications, and there's a whole family of things you can do. CMMC groups them into different levels and focuses on the defense industrial base and the need to better control the CUI, and provides levels of maturity, and for the first time will require DoD contractors or people doing business with DoD to comply with that, right? There are opportunities for research in terms of evolving the model to account for new threats, new controls, to be more effective, to be more efficient. And so, for the researchers, right, this is, we wanted to bring this to you because this is an area that kind of the technology research doesn't enough deal with, in terms of how is the research actually applied, and how does all of that come together, to solve problems, to solve, in this case, DoD and related national problems in terms of controlling important information. So I want to make sure that you see, and the research community sees, the need and the opportunity to contribute, right? Because it's here, it's coming, and it's going to affect a lot of people, a lot of organizations, and including research organizations. So in departing, I want to give the last word to Stacy, if she has any sort of words of encouragement, wisdom, or just to scare us to do the right thing. And what would you like the research community to take away from this and to contribute?
So I think we need your help. We need the brightest minds in the world, and that's who these guys are, to help us, make sure that we are covering the threats. If there are new ways that you can, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could develop a tool that would detect if we're being breached at that moment, or if we have hardware that has been compromised, if we could validate the security of the components that we're getting in, those kinds of tools, to be on the offensive as opposed to trying to play catch up and be on the defensive. And I think it's very important that we stay one step ahead of the game, and that we keep our fingers on the pulse of where our adversaries are going and how they're planning to attack us, and as we've seen throughout all of the things that we've had to come up against in the past several years, our adversaries are always changing, right? They're always coming with a new cool way to get at us, right? And so having the smart people help us stay one step ahead of that, to ensure that we keep our edge and keep ahead of the game, is very important. And so I would ask them to partner and to embrace this and help us and come to the market with the best and brightest things to protect us.
Excellent. So we're at the end. I want to thank you so much to all the panelists, Stacy, Katie, and Regan, for great discussion. A lot of good insights into what CMMC is and its impact. And I hope this was useful to the audience as well. So audience, thank you for participating and posing some good questions. We're at the end of the panel. Again, thank you all, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.